Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer, and today I'm returning for part 18 of my Commander the Great War series. I feel like I've kind of lost my way in the series and that there's been a pretty big gap between the last video and this one, although I actually recorded the video back in late December, around the time when the last video of mine went up. So I'm a bit behind, but again, I'm just kind of speaking over recorded footage that predates a lot of the recommendations and tips that you guys have been generously providing in the comments of my series so far. As you can see here, it is August of 1916. The Eastern Front has started to turn in favor of the Germans, who have been racing east, cutting off and destroying several Russian units. You can see there we just saw a Romanian unit move, so it appears that Romania has just entered the war here on August 17th of 1916. And the situation on the East Front is at least temporarily reversed, with the Russians retreating and the Germans advancing and doing great damage to the Russians as they do retreat. Meanwhile, we've slowed down a bit in the Caucasus region. You can see there the Russians have counterattacked, and they've got several units here that we're trying to cut off near Sevastopol and to the north of Depinhurisk, or however you pronounce that. The Sinai Peninsula is still mainly kind of, I guess, I don't know how to describe it. It's just a stalemate, I guess. And the Italian front is underexploited, but looks pretty open to being attacked. Meanwhile, the French and British continue to wear us down here on the Western Front, as technology and air power and more advanced artillery are beginning to take their toll. We haven't had the resources and manpower and I guess we haven't had the spare funds to invest heavily in airplanes, new artillery, and tanks. The Allies have certainly invested quite heavily in artillery and aircraft especially, which are allowing them to start making the front line a little bit more mobile in the West, which is dangerous for us because we really don't have a response to it. There you can see the newspaper has reported that Romania has gone to war on the Allied side. And yeah, so a new Austrian commander is available, and we're into late August of 1916. Interestingly enough, the Allies are making concerted attacks here as I'm trying to launch an offensive into Romania quickly. I'm not quite sure how strong Romania is, though. I don't have enough large units nor artillery support available as we kind of start this offensive here. You can see there the Romanians have, it looks like a good deal of, they've got 3 full army units here. So that's a good deal of support. I would say they're threatening to be flanked. You know, they're definitely in a situation where they could easily be flanked. But in my case, my Austrian flank is actually pretty much in the open. Situation, at least with the Russian army, they're still very strong and probably too strong to directly assault. But at least the situation's reversed, where Budapest is no longer under threat of Russian advance. Meanwhile, we're trying to slowly push the Russians back here. And on the Prussian front, if you will, we've advanced into Poland, threatening. Well, we just retook Prague, and moving into Russian territory now, threatening Breslau and Posen and Krakow, and hopefully soon Warsaw. You can see that the Russians have withdrawn probably too quickly there, as they've had several of their units get cut off, and maybe they're trading time, ground for time. I don't know, but the more units we can easily destroy, the better. Unfortunately, the time that it takes to destroy a pocketed unit certainly could come back to bite us, as it allows the Russians more time than we would like to reorganize and form a new defensive line. Maybe out somewhere near Danzig, I'm not quite sure. But they've lost 6 or 7 units here since this whole withdrawal has begun. Unfortunately, I've lost several units on the West Front, and soon, and if not soon, but maybe even now, I'm going to need to start repositioning troops west. As you can see there, I just did by rail to deal with these heavy Allied attacks against the Germans. Interestingly enough, this is right around the time that the Somme offensive was being launched by the British there. You can see I've cut off some British troops near Venice in Italy, but this is right around the time that the Somme offensive was being conducted by the British in 1916. It was during the heart of the Battle of Verdun. The French had stabilized by August of 1916. The Somme offensive actually began, I believe, in late July, early August of 1916, and it was a terrible blunder in some regards. The British, basically, it was their first major British offensive. Interestingly enough, the Somme offensive was originally, and this is not something that I knew, but it was originally intended to be an offensive that would be launched by the French primarily, with something like 40 French divisions being involved. But because the Battle of Verdun so heavily committed French forces, it ended up becoming the first major all-British offensive since the trench lines had been formed. There were some offensives in 1915, but 1916 was really that first, real big push by the British Empire in an attempt to break out of the stalemate on the Western Front. And while the early days of the Somme offensive certainly did not accomplish that by any means, I think it maybe goes down in history as being more futile than it was. Not to say that it wasn't futile. I mean, it was not a campaign or offensive which anyone should model their own goals and offensives along, but I would say that there were some follow-on attacks that were still part of the campaign, the Somme campaign, that were less disastrous. The initial disastrous attacks took place in July and August? Sorry, actually, July 1st was when the initial British assault went over the top. The French actually had a corps involved, so that'd be, like 3 or 4 divisions or something like that, and they actually had quite a bit of success. But the British were the ones who were absolutely cut down. There was some poor communication between artillery and infantry, so that when the British, who had launched a massive bombardment starting on the 24th of June, which was supposed to end on the 29th, but ended up lasting until the 1st of July because of some bad weather. But basically, the British launched a massive bombardment of over 15,000 guns for a week, eating through millions and millions of rounds of artillery. And, they had pounded heavily the German defenses. And it wasn't until when they went over the top on July 1st, the artillery was supposed to conduct a rolling barrage. So basically the British would get up out of their trench, they'd start moving across no man's land, and the artillery would continue hammering the Germans and then slowly kind of work its way forward to the second line of German trenches. This rolling barrage was designed essentially to keep the Germans in their dugouts and keep the Germans head down, preventing them from inflicting horrible casualties on the British as they crossed no man's land. However, as it actually ended up happening, for the most part, with a few exceptions, the British artillery just jumped straight ahead to the second trench line, allowing the Germans basically freedom to get out of their dugouts, out of their trenches, or not trenches, but get out of their their deep dugouts, which were being pounded, and they were forced to seek refuge basically in bunkers. It was allowing them to get out of there and get to their positions and return fire against the British. As a result, July 1st, I believe it was, as the bloodiest day in British military history. They had something like 48,000 casualties during the first 24 or 48 hours or so, because the British basically just got up and kind of strolled across no man's land and shoulder to shoulder, more or less, and were just mown down by the Germans. But while the Somme is represented in historical novels and accounts and whatnot as being this campaign of futility, that first day was not the whole story of the campaign of the Somme. It was certainly a big part of it, but the campaign actually would go from July 1st all the way through October and wouldn't really end until very, very early November. And actually, I believe the Battle of Cambrai, if not Cambrai, then it was fought in the same area, was actually a further fight during the Battle of the Somme. And you may, if you know much about World War I, you may know Cambrai was the first use of tanks in a, first successful use of tanks in the First World War. They had been used early in the Somme offensive as well, I believe, but they were very unreliable and broke down quite a bit. But in some of the later attacks, closer to October, the British actually managed to break through the German lines, largely with the support of armor and more effective rolling barrages, and they achieved quite a bit of success. They just lacked the coordination and the ability to follow up on those successes. So, in some ways, the Battle of Verdun, which was being fought further to the south, was designed by General Falkenhayn, who was the commander of the German forces, as a way to bleed the French dry. As it turned out, it turned into a battle of attrition where the attackers kept pouring more and more men in and lost very heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the French adopted basically a not 1 foot backwards, don't give up 1 foot of ground, and clung bitterly to their positions, which resulted in much higher casualties than would have been necessary had they been willing to trade ground for casualties against the Germans. The situation was reversed in the Battle of the Somme, where the Germans adopted their own no step backwards and basically kept counterattacking Allied attacks when they would successfully take their trenches. And this resulted in the Germans losing horrifically. Both sides lost over 500,000 men in this campaign. The British lost something like 420,000, the French 195,000, and the Germans 550,000, I believe. So, the Allies had something like 610,000 to 550,000 German casualties, but it probably could have been more effectively utilized by the Germans if they had been willing to give ground for casualties. I wonder, if a defense in depth mentality had been adopted by the German military on the Western Front in World War I, what the result of the war might have been. Would it have been, the same as what ended up happening, or would there have been a different result? I don't know, but I think it would be interesting to see. The Germans early in World War I took a lot of ground very easily. Well, not easily. I mean, it was very costly. They lost a lot of men, but quickly, I guess, would be more accurate. They took a lot of ground from the Allies quickly in the early days of World War I. And I wonder if they had been willing to trade ground for lives, if they would have suffered substantially fewer casualties, perhaps, and maybe inflicted the same sorts of casualties on the Allies. I don't think it would have been that far-fetched to say if the Germans kind of adopted the sort of Japanese World War II mentality of just, attempting to attrit their enemy to death without all these counterattacks and aggressive actions to maintain the front where it was, what would the losses have looked like? It would be interesting, because I think one of the perplexing things you see with World War I is if you look at the actual fights, the actual battles, you'd think with as devastating as the battles were for the attackers going over the top, as bloody as they were for the guys going over the top, why were all these battles so darn close in terms of casualties? Because they were, in a large degree, extremely close in terms of losses. 60,000 men is a big number. It's not to be scoffed at. But essentially, the British, who took 48,000 casualties on the first day of the Somme, you'd think, wow, you took that many casualties on the first day? This was, the battle that is known as being an all-encompassing and, just absolute bloodbath, and yet at the end of it, the Germans lost just barely 10% fewer men than the British or the French combined did in this campaign. What gives? You would think they would lose substantially more, and in fact, a lot of it had to do with the tactics. You were on the defensive, but you were always attacking. You'd lose your trench line, and you'd immediately counterattack, and that really negated a lot of the benefits that being on the defensive provided, because you were the guy then marching, through no man's land. You were the guy, exposing yourself to enemy machine gun nests in an attempt to take back what was, in most cases, a rather useless plot of land. So, again, I think it would be very interesting to look at the First World War and say, what if the Germans had agreed to fall back when the French would attack? So, defend your first trench line, the enemy comes up. As they come through no man's land, hit them real hard with counter battery and artillery fire, let the machine gunners mow them down, and then fall back to the next trench line and don't counterattack. Don't try and retake that first trench line. Focus on the second trench line, then do the same thing, and see how that would have resulted, how that would have ended up. Would the Germans end up losing substantially fewer men, or would the casualties still be the same? Would the trench warfare have caused, been so bloody and so one-sided that the German military by the end of the war would have been in better shape and more able to resist the Allied assaults? It's hard to say. But I definitely think that would be an interesting way to have fought the First World War from a strategic standpoint. The ground in Belgium was really more just a political thing than it was anything else. But another thing that's interesting with the Somme offensive, which the reason I'm talking about here is it takes place roughly around the same time as I'm playing this game, as I continue advancing eastward, maybe hopefully liberating Königsberg and eastern Prussia and all that. We'll see here if the Russians decide to form up a new defensive line against our Austrian and Belgian and Ottoman forces here in the south, now that the Romanians have entered the war. But another thing that I think is interesting that you don't see a lot of discussion about the Somme campaign is that there were a lot of techniques which would work very successfully later in the war, as you see kind of the especially very late war offensives start gaining large amounts of ground and breaking out of trench warfare. A lot of those tactics and lessons were learnt and were implemented starting with the Somme offensive. The Somme saw the first use of tanks, saw the first successful breakthroughs. There was actually cavalry, which went over the top at one point when the British did break through the German lines during part of the Somme offensive. So you started seeing signs that that static defensive line could be broken, could break down, and you could potentially open things up for a more open fight afterwards. And that's pretty shocking when you consider the fact that World War I is known as being trench warfare all the way up till 1918 when things kind of went different. But you already started to see the cracks forming in the strategies and tactics of trench warfare. You already started seeing the offensive starting to regain ground just a year or so after the trench lines had been drawn. Again, tanks, rolling barrages, surprise attacks without massive bombardments, all were things you started to see in the Battle of the Somme. And despite, the horrible casualties that the Allies lost in attacking, and likewise the Germans lost in defending, you started to see these lessons learned. So the Somme is another example, I think, of a battle where you find the myth of the blundering idiot generals and just the poor infantrymen who didn't have a chance because his officers were all idiots. But, throughout the Somme offensive, just a couple of months between when the offensive started and by the end of the offensive, you already saw officers putting to work critical lessons that they had learned earlier in the campaign or earlier in the war. So, that idea of the idiotic officer dooming his men was already somewhat becoming inaccurate and obsolete during the Somme offensive. Not that the officers were tactical or strategic geniuses, because they weren't, but as far as the historic tropes that you see pushed out there and promoted, they were already starting to become a bit obsolete by the time the Battle of the Somme was being fought, because officers were learning. They were adapting and implementing new tactics. But the problem is, in an offensive like that, or in a conflict like that, you can only learn so quickly. You have to put these things into practice, say, oh, maybe this will work, so what happens if we do it? And then you implement that strategy, and then, it's not going to work perfectly the first time. So you kind of go from there. And as you can see here, the Italian front, we've got quite a few troops. They're mostly worn down a bit, but the Allies definitely don't have enough manpower here to stop us, at least not what they have at the front line. So, hopefully we can have some success here as we drive into the Italian peninsula. Overall, this turn, has seen a little bit of consolidation here in the Eastern Front against the Russians, and now we're starting to see some advances here against the Allies in Italy, as well as attempting to cut off some Romanian troops at and around near Belgrade. Again, you can see here the losses that we're taking. We simply don't have enough industrial points or capacity to replace our casualties effectively. The Ottomans have very few industrial points. The Austrians probably are in the best shape in terms of that is concerned. Maybe the Bulgarians. But yeah, you can see here we're continuing to advance in the east. We haven't yet found that main Russian line of resistance. Meanwhile, things have definitely slowed down a bit here in the Caucasus region. I think someone mentioned in one of my comments about the fear of the Palestinians rising up against us. Fortunately, that hasn't happened yet. Don't really have any forces that are able or ready to be positioned against them should they go to war with us. You can see Portugal is just about ready to go to war with us here in September of 1916. The good thing about Portugal is while they give the Allies more manpower, they're at least not opening up another front. All they can really do is rail in or ship in or what have you more troops, which is definitely not something that I need to face on the Western Front, but it's also not like it's a new theater or front being opened up on my flank like Romania was. Again, you can see here all these fancy weapons, fighters, bombers, things that I wish I had some spare resources for, but alas, I do not. As we reach here mid-September of 1916, we are turned 59 out of 119, so we're getting pretty close to the halfway mark. Well, actually, exactly the halfway mark in the game if it does go to 1919. I'm not sure my manpower will be able to keep up, and with the Allied expansion and large-scale use of fighters to prep their assaults, something that I'm not sure I can hang on in the West long enough to get there. But again, 1916 technology is starting already to make trench warfare much more difficult on the defender than it was before, and I'm really struggling at this point to maintain the strength of my Western front line. They haven't broken through. They retook Antwerp. We quickly sealed that off. But it might be a good idea to start considering withdrawing back toward the German-Belgian border. As it is right now, I will not. It would free up a bunch of troops that we could, reposition maybe to Italy or to the east. At the same time, it's worth noting that even if we were to do that, even if those troops were freed up for other theaters, by shortening our line, the Allies would also be gaining valuable resources and troops that they could deploy to other sectors. And you can see here the Russians are now finally committing large-scale forces here at Kharkov against us. They've brought in an artillery battery and 2 full army or 2 full infantry units to counter us there, launching a strong counterattack, nearly destroying one of our Ottoman infantry units as well. Things are pretty stagnant here on the Eastern Front where the Bulgarians are. And I'd say this video is just about... Oh, okay. The Russians have decided to launch an attack, at least with 1 unit west of Danzig, so we may be about to run into that newly consolidated Russian position. It's hard to say. I have cut off troops near Bucharest, but unfortunately, as I was playing this, I forgot you can't cut off a capital city from supply. So that's definitely a big bummer. You can see here we're starting to see more Russian units here. So as we're starting to enter Warsaw and liberating a good chunk of Eastern Prussia, we're starting to perhaps run into a newly reformed Russian line. We may not have advanced or put enough pressure on them. We were too busy dealing with pocketed units and destroying and finishing off cut-off Russian troops than we were with advancing and leaving them to wither on the vine. In some sense, this is eerily similar to the German mistakes in World War I, or maybe not mistakes, but necessities of reducing the pockets of Russian troops that they would pass during the Blitzkrieg, which then caused them to have serious logistical issues and have their advance seriously delayed to the point where they were not able to conquer Moscow by the time winter came. You can see here Poland has declared war against us, so minor skirmishes in the African colonies earlier in the war. Poland basically sat out the war until 1916, and they have now joined the Entente against us. So Berlin appears to be safe at the very least, something that certainly is an accomplishment given where we were just a short time before. And meanwhile, the Russians starting to see kind of a scattered defensive line against us as we reduce this Russian garrison unit defending Posan, which is, I believe, a German city. Yeah, it's inside the borders. We've got a couple of units here in Prussia. But you can see here we reduced 1 Russian unit, and we bombarded them with artillery. Now we're going to hit these guys, cut off in Breslau with some air units, and then hopefully reduce the rest with our infantry and ground units. So we've retaken Breslau, and we continue to advance through western Poland toward Krakow and Moscow, or not Moscow, and Warsaw. So someone suggested previously in my last video that perhaps this was a sign of the Russian Revolution. I don't know if that is true. I don't know if the Russian retreat was scripted or if they felt they were overextended. I would guess it was probably scripted because it seemed like while we weren't losing dramatically anymore, certainly seemed the Russians had the advantage, if you will, early in that before their withdrawal started just a couple of months ago. You can see here the Germans finally have a decent amount of industrial points, but not enough to buy really any air units or anything useful against the Allied hordes of air units which are being used probably too effectively against dug-in troops. Air units were great for spotting during World War I, but they weren't all that effective in destroying, dug-in troops. They certainly were great at spotting, and they did have some bombing capabilities, but they weren't going to disrupt a trench line anywhere near being able to lead to a breakthrough. Although, again, perhaps air spotting might have given artillery the effectiveness it needed to do that. You can see here in Italy, we're continuing to advance, trying to destroy that garrison unit, open up another hole in the line maybe. Meanwhile, these other guys are continuing their attacks here against isolated enemy units. You can see here we're trying to drive south into Italy. Now, Italy is going to be a tricky challenge because we want to advance south toward Rome to knock Italy out of the war. At the same time, we're going to have to deal with enemy forces on our flank with French, Italian, and mainly French probably troops, because we could potentially open up a front in southern France if we advance well enough. But you basically have to advance south while continuing to protect your right flank against the French and other Italian forces in the north, and also be able to drive south toward Rome and deal with Italian forces we may be facing on the way there, that direction. So definitely a tough call to make. Meanwhile, this Ottoman army under Izzet Pasha is trying to get back to friendly supply, and maybe this other army here, extremely weak, just one hit point or one experience point left. Hopefully withdrawing further south will cause the AI not to want to act recklessly. Meanwhile, the Crimean Peninsula is almost all Ottoman by now, so it goes back to a medieval reconquest of the Crimea, something that the Ottomans lost quite some time ago, but are having success in retaking right now. We'll see here. Hopefully the Russians are a little bit too exhausted. I may pull one. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'll pull one unit from the kind of protection of my flank and rail lines here, rail them up against the Russians to prevent the Russians from pushing in and destroying that army unit, which is nearly gone already. And then one of the blocking forces will pull back to Stalingrad and hold out there, although it's not Stalingrad yet, obviously, as Stalin is not yet in power. The Ottomans, you had to use your resources so carefully as we try and replace some of our casualties here. We did manage to cut off at least one Romanian unit, and hopefully that'll allow us to reduce that unit in whatever that city is. I can't read there, but Bucharest, despite having 3 units surrounded, is the source of Romanian supply, so they're not going anywhere. Meanwhile, folks, we are into late September of 1916. We started in August, I believe, in this video, and this is part 18 of my Commander the Great War series. Talked for the most part about the Battle of the Somme, a historical discussion, something I haven't done a whole lot of lately. I've been talking more about gameplay than anything else. Hope that was an interesting change of pace. Hope you enjoyed it. But what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up and let you know that the video will pick up here after this. Obviously, after this video, part 19 will be the next episode, which will play the next couple of turns and continue to advance and hopefully deal Romania a decisive blow. But in the meantime, I just wanted to thank you for tuning in. It definitely means a lot. I'm not at 100,000, not at 1 million yet views, but we're actually getting pretty darn close. We're almost at 750,000 views here, and the pace of my views has actually picked up the last 3 or 4 months. So I'm pretty pleased with the way the channel's been growing, getting a lot more solid and consistent growth in terms of subscribers, viewers. October, then November, then December. Each one of them was a record, breaking the previous months before a record in terms of revenue for the site. Not that I make much, I really don't, but it's nice to get a little bit, help pay part of maybe a cable bill or something. So I appreciate you all tuning in, and I enjoy these videos. I'm going to continue these videos. I'd like to cover some other games as well, but just haven't had the time, and I don't want to abandon some of these other series which I have going on. So we're going to continue the Commander series, probably revisit Buzz Aldrin's Space Program Manager before too long, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. More to come from this. Also looking to do a War in the West series, probably starting before too long. But again, that's enough of me rambling here. Appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.